Donald Trump so blemished our democracy, so tried to destroy our democracy.
54 senators voted to pass the Republican-crafted funding bill, but Chuck Schumer's support made it the most controversial decision in recent Democratic politics. What happens when a party leader backs a move that his own base sees as a betrayal? Progressives called it a surrender, while moderates defended it as a necessary step to prevent a government shutdown. Did Schumer's decision signal weakness or strategic pragmatism? Will this divide reshape Democratic leadership? And how will it impact the party's chances in upcoming elections? In the intricate world of U.S. politics, few events capture the nation's attention as intensely as the looming threat of a government shutdown. In March 2025, such a scenario unfolded, placing Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer at the center of a political tempest. His decisions during this period not only averted a shutdown, but also ignited fervent debates within his own party and the broader political landscape. As the deadline approached, the U.S. government faced the possibility of a shutdown due to budgetary disagreements. The House of Representatives, led by a Republican majority, had passed a stopgap spending bill aimed at maintaining government operations through the end of September. The bill proposed keeping the spending level at $6.75 trillion, incorporating $7 billion in cuts. The intention was to prevent a partial government shutdown, but the bill's provisions sparked controversy, particularly among Democrats who viewed it as a concession to President Trump's agenda of reducing the federal workforce and government spending. Some Democrats were deeply concerned about the influence of Elon Musk, a key advisor to Trump, who had pushed for aggressive budgetary reductions and restructuring of government agencies. Schumer found himself at a crossroads. Initially, he opposed the Republican-crafted bill, criticizing its partisan approach and advocating for a short-term funding plan instead. He argued that the bill's provisions were inadequate and could potentially harm essential government services. However, as the deadline loomed and the risk of a shutdown became more imminent, Schumer reassessed his position. He expressed concerns that a shutdown would disproportionately empower President Trump and Elon Musk, enabling them to dismantle vital government services more rapidly. This perspective led Schumer to make a pivotal decision: to support the Republican bill to avert a shutdown, despite the potential backlash from his party. This decision did not sit well with many within the Democratic Party. Liberal activists and progressive members of Congress felt betrayed, viewing Schumer's support for the bill as a capitulation to Republican demands. The liberal group Indivisible went so far as to call for Schumer to step down as minority leader, reflecting the deep dissatisfaction among the party's grassroots. They argued that Schumer's decision undermined the party's leverage against President Trump's initiatives and signaled a lack of resolve in opposing policies they fundamentally disagreed with. For many progressives, this moment represented more than just a legislative compromise. It was seen as a betrayal of core Democratic values. The frustration was particularly evident among left-wing members of Congress. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a vocal critic of centrist Democratic strategies, openly questioned the wisdom of Schumer's decision. She argued that by caving to Republican demands without securing significant concessions, the Democratic Party was setting a dangerous precedent. If Democrats continued to fold under pressure, she warned, the opposition would have little reason to negotiate in the future. Some within the progressive wing even began murmurs about the need for a change in leadership, believing that Schumer's approach was too focused on short-term survival rather than long-term strategy. Amidst this internal party conflict, Schumer's rhetoric added fuel to the fire. During a live interview on a major news network, he referred to his Republican counterparts as bastards, a remark that quickly garnered media attention. The comment spread rapidly, dominating news cycles and drawing reactions from both sides of the aisle. Schumer swiftly apologized for the comment, acknowledging the inappropriateness of his language. However, the damage was already done. His choice of words became a talking point for Republicans, who used it to paint Democrats as hostile and unwilling to engage in bipartisan negotiations. Meanwhile, some members of his own party saw the remark as unhelpful, believing that it distracted from the more pressing debate over government funding. Despite the controversy, Schumer's decision proved pivotal in the Senate's passage of the funding bill. The bill passed with a 54-46 vote, with Schumer and 9 other Democrats breaking ranks to support it. This bipartisan support was crucial in overcoming the procedural hurdles that could have led to a shutdown. Schumer defended his decision by emphasizing the greater harm a shutdown could inflict, arguing that it would grant President Trump and Elon Musk unchecked power to dismantle government services. He believed that maintaining government operations, even under a less-than-ideal funding bill, was preferable to the chaos and uncertainty a shutdown would bring. Not all Democrats opposed Schumer's decision. Some moderates within the party, including Senator John Fetterman, supported his stance, arguing that avoiding a shutdown was paramount to protect millions of Americans from the detrimental effects of halted government services. Fetterman criticized the progressive wing's opposition, questioning the practicality of their stance and emphasizing the importance of pragmatic decision-making in governance. In his view, politics was about compromise, and refusing to accept any deal that wasn't perfect was an ineffective way to lead. The passage of the bill and Schumer's role in it sparked a broader debate about leadership and strategy within the Democratic Party. Some saw his decision as a necessary act of governance, an example of responsible leadership that prioritized stability over ideological purity. Others viewed it as an indication that the party lacked the resolve to stand firm against Republican policies. The divide between moderates and progressives within the Democratic Party had been growing for years, and this latest episode only deepened those ideological rifts. Beyond the Democratic Party, Schumer's actions had implications for the broader political landscape. Republicans, who had initially feared resistance to their spending plan, celebrated the bill's passage as a political victory. They argued that the Democratic Party's internal struggles had once again exposed its inability to unify around a clear legislative agenda. Some within the Republican leadership even speculated that this moment of division could be leveraged in future elections, portraying Democrats as disorganized and incapable of strong leadership. Meanwhile, political analysts debated what Schumer's decision meant for his future. Would this controversy weaken his influence within the Democratic Party, making it harder for him to rally support on key issues moving forward? Or would it ultimately be seen as a moment of strategic pragmatism that allowed him to outmaneuver a political crisis? Some suggested that Schumer's leadership position could be at risk, while others believed that his ability to navigate this difficult situation might actually solidify his standing. As the dust settled, one thing remained clear. The debate over Schumer's decision was far from over. The Democratic Party would have to grapple with the fallout, addressing the frustrations of its progressive base while maintaining the stability of its leadership. Meanwhile, Republicans would continue to use the moment as evidence of Democratic weakness. In the unpredictable world of U.S. politics, moments like these often became turning points, and time would reveal whether Schumer's gamble had secured stability or merely postponed a larger political reckoning. The political storm surrounding Chuck Schumer's decision had only just begun. In the immediate aftermath of his support for the Republican-crafted funding bill, the divide within the Democratic Party widened. Progressive voices grew louder, expressing frustration over what they saw as a failure of leadership. Meanwhile, moderates defended Schumer's actions, arguing that pragmatism had to take precedence over ideological rigidity. But as the days passed, it became clear that this was more than just a routine political disagreement. The fallout was shaping up to be a defining moment, not just for Schumer, but for the entire Democratic Party. Behind closed doors, discussions within the Democratic leadership became increasingly tense. Some party strategists worried that Schumer's decision had weakened the Democrats' negotiating power in future budget battles. By conceding to the Republican spending bill without securing significant policy compromises, they feared that the opposition had learned a valuable lesson. Democrats, when faced with the pressure of a looming shutdown, would ultimately fold. Others, however, saw things differently. They argued that avoiding a government shutdown had been the only responsible choice, regardless of the optics. The potential consequences of a shutdown, delayed federal payments, closed agencies, and weakened regulatory oversight, would have been far worse than the political backlash Schumer was now facing. While these internal debates continued, the public reaction remained divided. Progressive activists wasted no time in organizing rallies and online campaigns criticizing the decision. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags calling for new Democratic leadership trending nationwide. The liberal group Indivisible intensified its calls for Schumer to step down as Senate Minority Leader, arguing that he no longer represented the interests of the party's grassroots movement. These sentiments were echoed by younger, more left-leaning members of Congress, who saw this as the latest example of establishment Democrats failing to stand firm against Republican policies. On the other side of the argument, moderate Democrats, along with some political analysts, pushed back against the idea that Schumer had made a political miscalculation. They pointed to past shutdowns and their long-term effects, noting that while political factions often use shutdowns as leverage, the American public overwhelmingly disliked them. History had shown that government shutdowns rarely benefited the party responsible for allowing them to happen. In this view, Schumer's decision was not an act of weakness, but rather an act of governance, an effort to ensure stability, even in the face of criticism. Amid this heated debate, Republicans seized the opportunity to use Schumer's predicament to their advantage. Conservative media outlets framed the situation as proof of Democratic disarray, highlighting the growing division within the party. Leading Republican figures took to news programs and campaign events to reinforce this message. They argued that the Democratic Party was in turmoil, unable to present a unified front, and that this instability would make it even harder for them to counter Republican-led initiatives in the coming months. Beyond the political rhetoric, there were real legislative implications to consider. With the Republican-controlled House now emboldened by their victory in passing the funding bill, they saw an opportunity to push forward additional measures that aligned with their policy priorities. The belief among many in the GOP was that if Democrats had relented on the budget, they might do the same on other key issues. Immigration policy, tax reform, and healthcare funding were all areas where Republicans saw an opening. Some conservative lawmakers publicly stated that Schumer's decision had given them the upper hand, and they were eager to capitalize on it. Meanwhile, Democratic leaders scrambled to reassess their strategy. Schumer and his allies understood that they needed to regain control of the narrative before the opposition fully dictated it. Efforts were made to emphasize that their decision had not been a capitulation, but a temporary measure to prevent immediate harm. In interviews and press briefings, Schumer reiterated that while the funding bill had not been ideal, it had been necessary to prevent a disastrous shutdown that could have left millions of Americans without essential services. He also stressed that this was not the end of the fight, vowing to take a stronger stance in upcoming negotiations. Despite these assurances, frustration within the Democratic base did not dissipate. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other progressive lawmakers continued to apply pressure, warning that unless party leadership demonstrated a willingness to push back against Republican initiatives, voter enthusiasm could dwindle in the next election cycle. The progressive wing argued that compromises like the one Schumer had made only reinforced the idea that establishment Democrats were unwilling to take bold stands, a sentiment that had already led to primary challenges against moderate incumbents in previous election cycles. One of the most significant concerns among Democratic strategists was how this controversy would affect their messaging heading into future elections. With the party already facing challenges in maintaining voter enthusiasm, particularly among younger and more progressive voters, the risk of further alienation loomed large. Campaign organizers worried that if Democratic leaders failed to present a compelling vision moving forward, turnout could suffer in the next round of elections, potentially giving Republicans an even greater advantage. While Schumer worked to control the damage, President Trump and his allies took full advantage of the situation. At campaign rallies and public appearances, Trump wasted no time ridiculing the Democratic infighting, presenting it as proof that his opposition was unfit to govern. His messaging was clear. While Republicans had successfully advanced their budget priorities, Democrats were stuck fighting among themselves. This narrative played well with Trump's base, reinforcing the idea that his party was the one delivering results while Democrats remained gridlocked by internal conflicts. Within the Senate, some of Schumer's closest allies urged patience, believing that the controversy would eventually fade as new political developments emerged. They pointed out that past leadership decisions, even controversial ones, had not always resulted in long-term consequences. However, others were less optimistic. They warned that if Schumer did not take decisive action to reassure the party's progressive base, his leadership position could be at risk. While there was no immediate challenge to his role as Senate Minority Leader, some within the Democratic caucus were already discussing potential successors should the situation worsen. Schumer's approach to navigating this crisis would set the tone for his leadership moving forward. Would he attempt to bridge the gap between moderates and progressives seeking common ground within the party? Or would he double down on his centrist approach, prioritizing governance over party unity? His next moves would be closely watched, not just by his colleagues but by voters and political analysts alike. As the dust settled from the immediate fallout of the funding bill, a larger question remained. How would this moment shape the broader Democratic strategy? Would the party rally behind Schumer's leadership, or would internal divisions continue to grow? And perhaps most importantly, would this controversy mark a turning point in how Democrats approach negotiations with their Republican counterparts moving forward? The answers to these questions would not come overnight. But one thing was certain: the debate over Schumer's decision was far from over. In the weeks and months ahead, the implications of his choice would continue to reverberate throughout the political landscape, shaping the dynamics of Washington in ways that few could have predicted. The fallout from Chuck Schumer's decision to support the Republican-crafted funding bill continued to reverberate across Washington. While some Democrats urged patience, believing the controversy would subside with time, others feared the long-term damage to the party's credibility. The divide between moderates and progressives was growing deeper, and Schumer found himself at the center of a struggle that was no longer just about the government shutdown. It was about the very direction of the Democratic Party. Behind closed doors, Democratic strategists debated how best to contain the political damage. Some urged Schumer to take a more aggressive stance, doubling down on the argument that his decision had been necessary to prevent greater chaos. Others suggested a more conciliatory approach, acknowledging the frustrations of the progressive wing while emphasizing the need for party unity. The reality was that the party's base was split, and the leadership's response needed to strike a delicate balance. Schumer himself remained firm in his belief that his choice had been the right one, even as he faced mounting criticism. Meanwhile, the Republican Party saw an opportunity to press its advantage. With Democrats mired in internal disputes, conservative lawmakers pushed forward with a series of legislative proposals designed to test the opposition's unity. Immigration reform, corporate tax reductions, and cuts to federal agencies were among the key initiatives that Republicans hoped to advance in the wake of their victory on the funding bill. Their strategy was clear. If Democrats had backed down once, they might do so again. At the same time, Republican leaders took to the media to reinforce their message. They framed the Democratic infighting as proof that their opponents were incapable of governing effectively. In speeches and interviews, they painted Schumer as a weakened leader, arguing that his lack of firm resistance to the Republican spending plan signaled a broader dysfunction within the Democratic Party. Some went as far as to suggest that this was a turning point in American politics, where the balance of power was shifting decisively in favor of the right. Amidst these developments, Schumer's position as Senate Minority Leader became a subject of growing speculation. While no immediate challenge to his leadership emerged, whispers of potential successors began circulating among political analysts. Some suggested that figures like Senator Bernie Sanders or Senator Elizabeth Warren might step forward to represent the progressive wing more aggressively. Others pointed to younger rising stars within the party who could bring fresh energy and a new approach to leadership. For now, Schumer's grip on power remained intact, but the pressure was mounting. Adding to the complexity of the situation was the question of how this controversy would affect upcoming elections. The Democratic Party had already been facing challenges in maintaining voter enthusiasm, particularly among younger and more progressive constituents. The fear among some party insiders was that this latest episode would only deepen the sense of disillusionment that many voters already felt. If key Democratic leaders could not stand firm on critical issues, would voters turn away in frustration? The risk of declining turnout in future elections became a major concern, particularly in swing states where even slight shifts in voter participation could have significant consequences. Schumer, aware of these concerns, began making efforts to reconnect with his base. In a series of public appearances, he sought to reframe his decision not as a retreat, but as a necessary step to protect the government from dysfunction. He reiterated that this was not the end of the fight, promising that Democrats would stand firm on other key issues. But for many in the progressive movement, words were not enough. They wanted action, and they wanted assurances that similar compromises would not happen in the future. At the grassroots level, progressive activists continued to mobilize against what they saw as a pattern of Democratic concessions. Calls for new leadership grew louder, and primary challenges against moderate incumbents gained traction. The debate over the party's future was not just happening in Washington. It was happening among voters, community organizers, and political newcomers who saw an opportunity to push the party further left. The question now was whether Democratic leaders would respond to this shift, or whether they would continue to operate within the traditional framework of bipartisan negotiations. As the weeks passed, Schumer's approach to handling the controversy evolved. While he initially maintained a defensive stance, he eventually began making more overt attempts to rebuild bridges within the party. Behind the scenes, meetings were held between moderate and progressive lawmakers to discuss the path forward. Efforts were made to align messaging ahead of the next major legislative battles, with a focus on areas where the party could present a united front. While these efforts did not erase the underlying tensions, they were a necessary step toward maintaining party cohesion. In the broader political landscape, the effects of Schumer's decision extended beyond the Democratic Party. Internationally, allies of the United States took note of the internal divisions, particularly as they related to future negotiations on global issues. The perception of instability in Washington always carried implications for diplomatic relations, and this situation was no exception. Meanwhile, adversarial nations used the controversy as an opportunity to highlight perceived weaknesses in American leadership. The long-term impact of these dynamics remained uncertain, but they added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. With the dust beginning to settle, the question remained: what would be the lasting impact of this episode? Would it be remembered as a moment of necessary compromise or as a sign of democratic weakness? Would Schumer emerge from this crisis as a leader who made a tough but responsible choice? Or would his legacy be tarnished by accusations of capitulation? The answers would not come immediately, but one thing was clear: this was not a political moment that would be quickly forgotten. The consequences of Schumer's decision would continue to shape the political landscape for months, if not years, to come. As the focus began to shift toward the next major policy debates, both parties prepared for the battles ahead. For Democrats, the challenge would be to mend internal divisions while proving to voters that they could still lead with strength and conviction. For Republicans, the goal would be to maintain momentum and use their recent victory as a foundation for further legislative gains. The stage was set for another round of intense political maneuvering, and the stakes remained as high as ever. The tension surrounding Chuck Schumer's decision had not faded. While the Democratic Party attempted to present a united front, the underlying fractures remained visible. Schumer, determined to regain control of the narrative, doubled down on his messaging. He insisted that the decision to support the funding bill had been a calculated move to prevent a government shutdown that could have led to widespread economic and administrative disruption. His argument was simple: governance required tough choices, and sometimes those choices meant accepting less than perfect compromises. Despite this, the progressive wing of the party remained skeptical. Many within the movement saw Schumer's decision as part of a broader trend of establishment Democrats conceding too easily in legislative battles. To them, this was not an isolated incident, but rather a symptom of a larger problem. They believed the party's leadership had become too focused on political survival and not focused enough on delivering real change. Progressive organizers continued to push for a reassessment of Democratic priorities, arguing that unless the party took a stronger stance on key issues, it would risk further alienating its base. Schumer's supporters, however, pushed back against this notion. They pointed to past government shutdowns and the damage they had caused to everyday Americans. Federal employees going without pay, delays in essential government programs, and the economic uncertainty that came with shutdowns were all factors that had to be considered. Schumer's allies argued that preventing a shutdown was a responsibility that outweighed the short-term political cost. They acknowledged the frustration from progressives, but insisted that allowing the government to grind to a halt would have been far worse. As Schumer navigated the political turbulence, Republicans worked to solidify their position. With the funding bill secured, they turned their attention to other legislative priorities, confident that they could use their recent success to push forward additional measures. Some Republican leaders openly stated that Schumer's decision had given them a roadmap for future negotiations. If Democrats had been willing to bend on this issue, perhaps they would be willing to bend on others. The Republican leadership saw an opportunity to advance policies that they had struggled to pass under previous Democratic resistance. At the same time, Democratic strategists were well aware of the risks ahead. If Schumer and his allies failed to rally the party before the next major round of negotiations, Republicans would enter those discussions with even more confidence. Democratic lawmakers began emphasizing unity in their messaging, attempting to shift focus toward shared priorities rather than lingering disputes. The goal was clear: to prevent further internal discord from giving Republicans an even greater strategic advantage. The broader political landscape also began shifting in response to the controversy. Voter engagement became a key area of concern, particularly as progressive activists intensified their efforts to challenge incumbents who they believed were too willing to compromise. Primary challenges against moderate Democrats gained traction, with grassroots organizations rallying behind candidates who promised to take a firmer stance against Republican policies. Schumer, as the party's leader in the Senate, was at the center of these debates. His ability to navigate the coming months would determine not only his standing within the party, but also the overall direction of Democratic strategy. As the dust settled, the long-term consequences of Schumer's decision began to take shape. Some Democrats viewed the situation as a necessary reality of governance, while others saw it as a critical misstep. Republicans, meanwhile, celebrated what they saw as a moment of Democratic weakness, using it as a case study in political maneuvering. The battle over legislative priorities was far from over, and both parties prepared for the next round of negotiations. With political stakes higher than ever, the lessons learned from this episode would shape the strategies of both Democrats and Republicans in the months ahead. With that, we have reached the end of Roday's video. If you have come this far with us, be sure to check out other videos on the channel.